I would like to welcome Sarah Browne and Veronica Gray to the Lunchtime Seminar platform today. Thank you both for taking the time to present today, especially as we know this is a busy time for you, as this is Safer Aging Week. So thank you both. Veronica. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Alison, and thank you for the opportunity to come along today to present at today's seminar. My name, as Alison has said, is Sarah Browne, and I'm one of the trustees on the board of Hourglass, and I'm joined today by Veronica, and Veronica is our Deputy CEO in Hourglass and Director of Policy. And just a little bit before I hand over to Veronica about Hourglass, some of you may be familiar with the charity, but I suspect maybe some of you are not. But Hourglass is the only UK specialist charity working across all 4 nations, seeking to put an end to the harm, abuse and exploitation of older people. But also we are keen to work towards creating a society which values safer ageing and allows older people to live free from abuse. It's estimated that in the UK, around 2.7 million people over the age of 65 are affected by abuse. And that's a staggering 1 in 5 older people. So that is why we feel it's important to constantly try to raise awareness about the prevalence of elder abuse, but more importantly, to ensure that individuals and organisations are confident to know that they could recognise abuse and how to report it, how to report on their concerns. Veronica obviously will tell you a lot more about the work that we do within Hourglass, but we also run a 24/7 helpline, which is the only UK-wide elder abuse helpline dedicated to supporting older people and providing a casework service. And as Alison has said, we were particularly pleased to be asked to do this presentation today because this is our 4th Safer Aging Week. And hopefully some of you may have seen across social media outlets because we're trying very hard this particular week to raise the profile. Our theme, as Alison has said this year, is a lone voice, because all too often, as our research shows, older people are left voiceless and lonely. More than ever, we need to make sure that their voices are heard to ensure that they can grow old safely. And this time last year, we produced the first ever Safer Aging Index for Northern Ireland. And Veronica, I know in her presentation, will share with you some of the highlights from that landmark report. But our ultimate goal, I suppose, in Hourglass is to help policymakers, yourselves as practitioners, statutory and voluntary organisations to work closely together to create a safer ageing society for all older people in Northern Ireland. So I would now like to hand over to Veronica for her presentation. Thanks, Veronica.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Alison, and thank you all for taking time out of what I know are very busy schedules to join us today. It's great to have this opportunity to chat to you. So Sarah has told you a little bit about Hourglass. We have been around for 30 years. Our former guise was as Action on Elder Abuse, which you might be familiar with, but we have been based in Northern Ireland since 2015. As Sarah said, safer ageing and working for a safer ageing society is first and foremost in our minds. We want environments and procedures around all of us, so that older people and us as we age ourselves are not put at risk of abuse and neglect. You know, we do try and shape government policy. We have been highly involved in the domestic abuse legislation over recent years. But we also want to collaborate with key stakeholders and other frontline organisations to help nurture our agenda. And that's why opportunities like today to talk to you is so important for the charity. We do undertake and commission research, and I'll reference some of our unique research as we go through this afternoon. But ultimately, we're campaigning to bring about that positive change for all older people. So when it comes to abuse of older people, we work to the definition that you'll all be very familiar with: a single or repeated act or lack of action occurring in any relationship where there's an expectation of trust. And we constantly have to remind people that older people are the victims of the same types of abuse as victims of all other ages. So that's financial or economic, physical, sexual and psychological abuse, and many others suffer due to neglect. The problem that we have continually is public awareness. Back in 2021, around this time, the charity produced a report called Last in Line, where we sought to highlight that older people, when it comes to public policy, public awareness, and government action, older people are last in line for support. We surveyed general public across the UK, and we asked them what they thought of when they heard the word abuse. So 20% of people told us they thought about animals, and only 7% said older people. During that research, we also did an analysis of Twitter references across the calendar year. And I will just highlight that these particular set of figures are UK-wide because of the nature of how the research was undertaken. So of 500,000 references to domestic abuse on Twitter in 2021, only 1,300 related to older victims of domestic abuse, which is about 0.3%. We also noted that the Home Office, Secretary of State, key ministers, Permanent Secretary, all tweeted about domestic abuse, but not once mentioned older people. And at that time, the Prime Minister did not mention abuse of older people once in the year. And I suppose whenever we talk about lack of public awareness, we find that grouse shooting was mentioned nearly 4 times more often than the abuse of older people. Fox hunting was mentioned almost 20 times more often, and car parking was mentioned nearly 30 times more often than the abuse of older people. And people tweeted about animal abuse 6 times as often as they tweeted about the abuse of older people. So with this lack of government focus, public and policy focus, Hourglass also is in line, last in line when it comes for funding for vital services. So just to tell you a little bit and explain really how the charity works. This model will be very familiar to you as the adult safeguarding continuum. And I think it's a useful way to frame how we deliver our services, from prevention, education, early intervention, right through to recovery, moving on and keeping safe. So obviously at the bottom tier, the green tier of the pyramid, that's there to represent the majority of people over 60 who are living their lives free from harm, abuse, exploitation, and have maybe no need for support or a very low level need for support in order to keep themselves safe. And at that point, Hourglass delivers a range of services, but they're light touch and they're available to all. So at the moment, for example, we're doing a lot of work around ensuring that we have referral and signposting information for older people who might be lonely at Christmas if they're contacting our helpline, and if they might not have somewhere else to go. Obviously, we work in partnership with other agencies and organisations to do that. So as we know, due to maybe a life change or change in personal circumstances, any older person may find that they need additional support to keep themselves safe and protect themselves from further harm. And that's where we see those people moving into the amber zone. So while there's a lesser number of people in this zone, there is an increased service need from Hourglass to help those older people to protect themselves, stay safe and move back into that green zone. And we have a range of services to help and support those older people. At the tip of the pyramid then, the red zone, as it suggests, is the danger zone. These are the most high risk and most serious cases of abuse of older people, or older people in urgent need of help and support. And that's where, again, Hourglass has a very bespoke offering. Again, we're dealing with a lesser number of people, but the support required from the charity is more intensive. After then we intervene at each level, our ambition is to see recovery moving on and keeping safe. But all of our work is grounded, so all of that frontline service delivery is grounded in policy, research, our lobbying, our campaigning, media and thought leadership. We deliver training, webinars, conferences, and of course we work in partnership. So to maybe put that into more context and give you a practical understanding of the services that we have. So on the left-hand side, these would be universal services. So we have a free phone confidential 24/7 helpline service, and that's available right across the UK. We have an instant message service available through our website. We have a free text, free email, and we have a chatbot on our website. Now, instant messenger, text message and email are still currently only available Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. And that's a resource issue. We haven't yet been able to fundraise to turn those services into 24/7, but the chatbot is there as well. On our website, then you will find all of our policy work, policy briefings. There's the most recent one is around male victims, older male victims of abuse, and another one on sexual abuse of older people. So all of our policy and research is available. We have information and advice. We have booklets and leaflets and guides for people to download and print out. We put all our regional and national updates on, and all of our campaign information is there. Our knowledge bank then is a repository of information, and it's broken down by country, and then within that it can be broken down further. So it's very specific signposting information, and it's relating to anything around safer ageing, abuse of older people, ageism, keeping older people safe. We've got law and legislation on there. All of our webinars, we do a monthly webinar, and all of those are on there for people to watch back. So that's really an invaluable resource. And just to give you some context for that, last year we had over 16,000 users of the Knowledge Bank. And we would always say to any other organisation, if you feel you have information that you want other people to know about, please send it to us and we'll host it on our Knowledge Bank. So in terms of community response, whenever we get a phone call through or an instant message or a text or an email, that call will be dealt with at that point. And if it's a basic, sort of a standard question or query, that information and support will be given there and then on the phone. If it's something that is a bit more detailed, that will be triaged over into what we call community response. And we have community response available right across the whole of the UK. And our community response caseworkers then will take on the case and provide dedicated support, advocacy, tailored advice, and all of that is grounded in nation-specific expertise. We do have IDVA and IDVAs, but we don't, unfortunately, yet have that service in Northern Ireland. And in terms of our safer ageing work, that's where we do a lot of our training, our conferences, and webinars, awareness raising, and pop-up clinics. So that's how the charity works. As Sarah's already said, like 1 in 5 people over the age of 65 are affected by abuse. So when we drill that down and we look at Northern Ireland, that will equate to almost 90,000 people over the age of 60 experiencing abuse in Northern Ireland. And that is just a massive number. And when we think if we try and personalise that and think, and I think I have 2 elderly parents, I have a very elderly uncle, and I have a number of aunts and uncles that all come into this age bracket. And I think 1 in 5, like that's probably 2 out of my family that potentially will be affected, and that's a scary number. So how Hourglass works and how we help, we are getting busier year by year, and that is good because more people are getting the help and support that they need, but is it also indicative of increased levels of abuse? And we don't know that, but I do know that we took 4,000 calls in 2018-19, and that was over 10,000 actual calls to the charity last year. And then when we add all of our other elements of service, That brought us to over 30,000 impacts across last year, and we're on target to hit about 50,000 impacts in this current financial year. The average age of the victim that we deal with is 75, and the majority of victims are female. But there's a sizable minority of male victims. So we're currently looking at about 40% of our workload being male victims. And in the cases that we deal with, most victims are abused by a family member or close relative or friend. And in fact, it's usually an adult son or daughter or a grandchild. Only about 20% of our calls come directly from the victim. The majority of our work starts with a concerned person, but through our processes, we will eventually then come to speak to the victim themselves. And financial abuse accounts for the vast majority of our workload, around 40% of our calls every year. And that call number is increasing, but so too is the actual monetary value involved in those calls. So between 2017 through to 2022, there was a 50% increase in the amount of money reported to us as stolen, defrauded, or taken from older people. And that didn't even account for cases that involved property. So you can see there just the breakdown, where we have 40% of our work last year around economic abuse, closely followed then by psychological abuse. And obviously we deal with more than one form of abuse in most cases. And most of the people that Hourglass supports are actually abused in their own home. While we know that the media very often will like to talk about abuse in care homes and hospitals, our experience is a little bit different. We're dealing with very vulnerable, very isolated people living in their own homes. So people really like Martin. Martin told us a story. Martin was 76 and he had lived with his wife for many years, and after she passed away, he found it very difficult to cope. He told us he had lost his best friend. He naturally inherited the house after his wife passed away, and Danny, her son, had always lived with the couple, but he had never paid any rent or bills, and his mum had never even asked him to. And Martin was reluctant to broach the subject with Danny. But Danny got worse over time, and Martin felt like he knew there was no scrutiny anymore. There was no one looking out, so he really had free rein to do as he wanted. Martin knew Danny resented him, and he thought he should have inherited the family home, and increasingly became abusive towards Martin. He would stop him leaving the house, even for doctor's appointments, treated him like a child, would lock him out of the house if he wasn't at home by a certain time, had to have his dinner on the table at a certain time, Monday to Friday. He had an hour's grace at the weekend for dinner to be provided. And eventually then Danny set up a joint bank account for the two of them, suggesting it was because Martin was getting older and wasn't able to manage or cope or be trusted to spend his own money. So eventually it got worse, and while the control remained, there was a lot of verbal abuse and psychological abuse began. And eventually Martin felt that this was going to escalate and it was going to result in physical violence. And it was at that point that Martin reached out to Hourglass. And that reminded me of another case. It was Roy. And this case study is in Roy's own words. He was having a hard time, pressures of work and family, but he drank a bit too much trying to cope, and it got worse. He lost his job and his marriage, and it was a very difficult time. Of course, I took him to live with me. I couldn't see him on the streets, and he had run out of friends' sofas to sleep on. But the drinking got worse, and then the gambling came. It was taking a toll on him mentally. But it was taking a toll on me too. He wouldn't look for a job, drank morning to night, and the few pounds he had were gambled away. But then it was my money. I'm living on a pension and I didn't have much, but I was afraid to say no. He was angry. He would tell me to hurry up and die. I was a waste of fresh air. He'd poke and nip me and shake me whenever I would say no. He sold all the furniture until all I had was my bed and he had a mattress on the floor. Life wasn't worth living. I had no money, the flat was cold, and there was no food in the cupboard. I had my bus pass, so I got out a wee bit, but I didn't know where to turn. I was out of my mind with worry. But Hourglass was a lifeline. I'm now living in a new flat. I haven't got the best of furniture yet, but it's comfortable and warm. I have my pension and he has his own place and he's getting help with his problems. Hourglass saved us both. So those are just two examples, two stories that some of our service users have told us to illustrate how difficult and challenging the situations are that older people are dealing with. Back in 2020, Hourglass commissioned some research to try to better understand public attitudes towards abuse of older people. And I will just say, this was a UK-wide survey, but the figures that you have there are specific to Northern Ireland. So when we went out and we polled the general public in Northern Ireland, about 90% of people said they believed the abuse of older people was a problem today. But nearly 70% said they didn't feel confident that they would know how to spot the signs of abuse. And more than 2/3 said that they wouldn't know what to do then if they suspected an older person was being abused. And what I found really interesting was we gave participants in this survey a range of quite common physical and behavioural indicators and signs of abuse. And almost 1/5 of them weren't able to identify those as signs of abuse. They attributed all of those indicators to suspected dementia. So we have a real block across society in terms of recognising that abuse of older people exists. And again, so whenever we drill down into the different types of abuse, we find that around 30% of people in Northern Ireland didn't think trying to change the will of an older person was abuse. 1/3 didn't think using power of attorney over an older person for personal financial gain was abuse. 33% didn't see domestic abuse or domestic violence directed towards older people as abuse. And in fact, the figure for the general public even recognising that domestic abuse happens after the age of 65 is actually in below 1%. Again, another 1/3 don't see verbal threats, mockery or intimidation as abuse, pushing, hitting or beating an older person. And just it's staggering to think that 35% didn't see that inappropriate or unwanted sexual comments or acts as abuse. And almost 40% of people in Northern Ireland didn't see taking money from an older relative's bank account without permission as abuse. Now, I find all of that shocking. And when we look at what the general public in Northern Ireland have told us here, they have told us that there is a very casual attitude towards abuse of older people. And in fact, an even more worrying attitude towards what in some cases are actually crimes against older people. The full range of that research is available on our website. So I'll just move on. Sarah has mentioned the Safer Ageing Index for Northern Ireland, which was released just about this time last year. And during this week, Safer Ageing Week, we will be releasing the equivalent for Wales and for Greater London. I've mentioned that we don't have the information to produce one for Scotland. And then next year at our first Hourglass conference, which will be in Brighton on the 19th of March next year, we will be releasing the remaining indexes for the other regions of England, working to eventually have a full UK-wide Safer Ageing Index. So the Safer Ageing Index really is just a state of the nation report looking across 5 key aspects, sort of the cornerstones of what we would see as important factors in ageing safely. The audience, the intended audience, is policymakers, practitioners, governments, businesses and third sector organisations, also statutory sector, anyone with an interest and commitment to achieving safer ageing. And I think it's important really when we talk about safer ageing to really to understand what that means. Safer ageing in a nutshell, in Hourglass language, is prevention. It's about encouraging us all to think about, what does this future hold for me? We all want to grow old, but we want that to be safe, and we want to enjoy that process of growing old. And within that, we need to challenge a lot of the media bias and stereotypes and tropes that we see that portray ageing very negatively, because it is a time to be celebrated, but it must be safe. So that's why the Safer Ageing Index was so important to us. So we took a deep dive into population, health, economics, crime and isolation. And we sort of came up with a scorecard to assess each council area in Northern Ireland against their progress in achieving safer ageing for all. So I have just pulled out some of the headlines from the index. You can see there, that's just a snapshot of how the index is laid out, and you can see the link to where you can find it on the Hourglass website. So some of the key findings really, we find Mid-Ulster is actually the safest place to grow old in Northern Ireland, or certainly the index would suggest that. From a victims of crime perspective, Fermanagh and Omagh is the safest area in Northern Ireland. And unsurprisingly, maybe, older people are 48% more likely to be victims of crime in Belfast than the Northern Ireland average. Over 65s are twice as likely to be economically active in Fermanagh and Omagh than in Belfast. And those older people in rural or coastal areas, we find, are more mobile and in less long-term pain than their urban counterparts. The most income-deprived older people are more likely to live in rural coastal areas as opposed to urban. So while they are more mobile and in less long-term pain, they are also suffering economically. What we found, however, is that data collection has not fully recovered from the COVID-19 pandemic, which makes it difficult to understand and fully support. We often say, if it's not tracked, it's not fact. So, and we can't measure, we can't fully understand an older person's life or circumstances if we don't have meaningful data to gauge that against. What we did find, however, through developing the Safer Ageing Index for Northern Ireland is that there is no political attention really focused on supporting older people. And obviously we haven't had a government in Northern Ireland since February of last year. And we are very clear that that is stymieing progress, and we need that support, not only to make sure that appropriate decisions are being made, but from a charity point of view, it's also stymieing the funding environment. And there is a blog post has gone out today where I have made that point, I hope loud and clear. But to give an example, after 20 years of the Department of Health's core grant scheme being closed to new applicants, last year it was opened to new applicants for the very first time. And how I describe it in my blog post today is it became an omni-shambles. It was overly subscribed. There had been no forward planning around how many organisations were to apply. The guidance was lacking, and it resulted in that fund being shut down. Those organisations who were in current receipt of core grant funding from the department got an extension of 3 months. Those who were new to the fund got nothing, and actually we're all still in limbo. And I personally know a lot of projects that have actually shut down because that core grant was taken away. So we can't trundle on in this vacuum any longer. It is harming people. So if we just look at the isolation index, you can see there Belfast obviously rating the highest in terms of issues around isolation and loneliness for older people. But when we take Belfast out, Causeway, Coast and Glens actually just tips Derry City and Strabane. But in every category that we looked at across the index, once we removed Belfast, it was almost always Derry City and Strabane came second. So we've got an analysis now that shows where we need to be targeting our efforts around protecting older people and making it safer for them to age. But you can see there then, when it comes to isolation, people in Mid and East Antrim are reporting very high levels of satisfaction around their social engagement and engagement with their communities and activities. So why is that important? Well, we know now that nearly a quarter of over 65s in Northern Ireland are living alone, and in Belfast that's actually over a third. Older people in Belfast are 40% more likely to be living alone than the average, but Mid and East Antrim has the lowest prevalence. Living alone in older age stemming from divorce or bereavement may be linked to a higher risk of mortality compared to older people who live with others. As we know, isolation and loneliness have been identified as increasing the risk of poor physical and mental health. So these are big, big issues that once we have identified, we need to work to do something around that loneliness piece. Another piece of research that we did in 2020 was Older Voices of the Pandemic, and that research is on our website. And what we found when we talked to older people at that time living in lockdown was that a high proportion of them said that living in lockdown under all those very stringent restrictions that we had back then, they said life was no different. And I thought, for most of us, you know, we couldn't go to work as normal, we couldn't go shopping as normal, we couldn't do all the normal things. And I think personally, I felt all of those restrictions. But for someone then to say, well, it's no different, living like this is no different to my daily life pre-pandemic, that was really quite stark for me. And especially when we know that isolation is associated with a 32% increase in stroke risk, 30% increase in heart disease, and a 50% increase in developing dementia. So addressing some of these issues at a local level will eventually, the knock-on impact is that we're seeing less older people going to primary care or going to hospital and needing support through the NHS if we can address these issues at a societal level. So when it came to health, as I mentioned, Belfast is top in each index, and when taken out then it's Derry City and Strabane. And again, ours in North Down featured very well in the health index. People there had lower levels of health complications and issues. So we've seen a much higher proportion of mobility and dexterity difficulties and long-term pain and discomfort in urban areas like Belfast and Derry City and Strabane. Whereas in rural or coastal areas, we saw that come down, and that's likely due to a greater opportunity to participate in physical activity and exercise, which obviously helps stave off mobility and dexterity issues. But we also became aware through the development of the index that socioeconomic disadvantages can also lead to older people suffering from increased loneliness and isolation and threaten mental and physical health. So we know, for example, that if older people haven't got sufficient income, and with the current cost of living crisis and all of the issues that result in that, if older people don't have the disposable income, then they're not going to be going out and about and meeting other people, which then obviously affects their mental and physical health. So I just wanted, we're coming close to the end and I'm looking forward to hearing all your questions. Just wanted to tell you a little bit about our Alone Voice campaign for this Safer Aging Week 2023. So as I say, the theme is Alone Voice. And the rationale really is that over recent years, there has been an increased focus on violence against women and girls. And that is right. And we have also seen recently, quite recently actually in England, 2 male abuse charities have received significant government funding to increase their work and their reach. And that is right too. So we need that to happen. But addressing the abuse of older people through a violence against women and girls lens is not the right strategy to meet the specific issues for older people, male and female. So what we have found is that our older people remain lone voices. Older people have significant barriers when it comes to reporting abuse. And when they do, they don't, in the experience of the charity, they don't always receive the appropriate response. So, for example, Maureen contacted the charity when she identified that her niece had stolen £12,000 from her. And she was very courageous, and she decided that she wanted to report this crime to the police. And when the police officers came to take her statement, they actively discouraged her from taking it forward. And they even used her granddaughter as leverage in making that case for her to drop the criminal aspect and the investigation. And that's not right. That's denial of justice. However, Maureen persisted, and her case did go to court, and her niece was found guilty. She was given a 6-month suspended sentence and ordered to pay £500 victim compensation. So again, that is not justice. So we have a huge piece of work to do right across the criminal justice system, from our police service right through to our judiciary in terms of sentencing. And that's not to say that we don't have really good relationships with the police service, and we know that a lot of them are working very hard and are very passionate actually about this issue. But we need increased awareness and understanding. And that's why Hourglass is continually calling for victim parity. We want the abuse of older people to be taken as seriously as abuse of children and young people, as a violence against women and girls, as animal cruelty. We want it right up there. And we also then want to see specialist services for older victims and survivors. If you think back to our model of service delivery, when we work with an older person and we're delivering our casework and advocacy support, some of those cases can take months and months, and they could extend to years if we had the resource to continue to deliver that service. But we also know that an older victim of abuse will experience that differently. They will very often experience post-traumatic stress disorder, and we know that abuse occurring in later life can be a life-shortening experience, which is all the more reason for that specialist, highly intensive support. So we would like to ask you to show your support during this Safer Aging Week for Hourglass as a lone voice who are campaigning day and daily and tirelessly around these issues, but show too your support for the older victims who are marginalised, sidelined, and often ignored or not listened to. So the challenges as we see it in Hourglass. Domestic abuse and the abuse of older people obviously are coinciding concepts that are misunderstood, and Hourglass works across all of that spectrum. With an ageing population and already high prevalence rates, cases of abuse are going to continue to rise, and we need proper services for these older victim survivors. Public awareness and professional understanding has to be improved. The statistics that I've highlighted today just show that we're starting from such a low baseline in terms of public awareness. And I think if we can challenge that, if we have more people that are able to recognise the signs of abuse and know where to come to get help and support, that's going to protect so many more people. We do need a particular focus and probably strategy to tackle the growing issue of financial and economic abuse. And we need to dismantle all of the barriers to disclosure and insufficiency of support. I have said, and I'll say it again, it is right that we look at violence against women and girls, and Hourglass fully supports that strategy. But domestic abuse is a gendered crime, but 1 in 3 victims are male. and half of male victims do not disclose, and we can't close our eyes and our ears. We can't marginalise male victims even further. And we need to do a piece of work around the criminal justice system, which so often, unfortunately, deters older victims from seeking justice. So the way forward, as I see it today, is awareness and understanding of the scale, nature and indicators of abuse, adequate legislative and policy protections. Unfortunately, we still have got no further in our adult protection bill for Northern Ireland. We also want to see a change in law so that those who abuse, harm or exploit older people are actually dealt with more severely by the courts. An older man recently, or well, a while ago, said to me, when it comes to older people, crime really does pay, because there's no adequate justice. We will continue to lobby and campaign for greater awareness and greater funding, and put our efforts into prevention and forward planning. In an ideal world, this charity wouldn't need to exist. But until that time comes, we will continue our efforts. And we want to see an increased focus for the charity around partnerships that protect. And that's why opportunities like today to talk to you, to let you know about who we are and how we work and the kind of things that we deal with are just so important to us. So that last slide is there just to let you know the different ways that you can get in touch. So obviously all of our helpline, it's free to contact the helpline. The text message service is free. The number for the helpline will not appear on a phone bill, but the number for the text message service will, but it will not be identifiable as Hourglass. Our email, our instant message, our chatbot and our knowledge bank, all details are there. And just to leave with the words of another one of our service users who said, I felt it was a family matter. I thought no one wanted to hear about it, and I find it hard to talk, but Hourglass were there for me. So I would beg you today, really, just to take this information and share it as widely as you can, because we never know who needs to know. That's it from me. Thank you.
Alison, you're on mute.
Oh, there we go. Technical hitch always. So thank you very much, Veronica and Sarah. I know I find that very helpful, and especially somebody who has older parents and family as well. I have had, let me see, couple of wee questions. Well, there's one question directly to me. Veronica, maybe you can answer it, and I know you did address part of it in the presentation. As an individual, how can we show our support to this?
Certainly the easiest thing to do is to follow our social media, so you'll see everything that we're doing there. From our website, we have a newsletter sign up again. Sign up to that because you'll find out all the information. But just talk to people, tell people that the charity's here. We can send out information leaflets, flyers, tell people about the services that are available. It's about having that conversation. Because all too often, unfortunately, we find that people only realise the charity exists when they're in that moment of crisis. They only find us when they absolutely need us and they have run out of other options, or they're not getting the support that they need. And that's when they come to us, and that's too late. We want people coming to us now, you know, have these conversations around what safe aging means, and, you know, how to keep yourself safe. And, you know, we can send people out to do training and presentations at older people's networks, all of that.
And I suppose the other thing, Veronica, is, and people will find it on our Hourglass website, is the webinars, which often are you know, just give a lot more detail, whether they'll be themed. So it might be about financial abuse or power of attorney. And we would invite sort of specialists, people who have expertise in those areas to join the webinar, just to give a bit of, I suppose, Veronica, it's true to say that often the webinars, we will get practitioners and people from other organisations and agencies, but also we get members of the public joining the webinars because they have seen it and think, oh, well, that's something I would like to know more about, whatever aspect it is. So it's something else that folk on this morning's seminar might be interested in, just looking out for the webinars that generally every month, 6 weeks or so. There's a few on the website at the minute that people can register for, and they're free and they're available afterwards, just as the NISC seminars are, to download afterwards and watch if you're not able to attend when they're running live.
Okay. Veronica, just as we're talking, somebody's asked what the email address was. Maybe you could stick it in the chat.
I sure will.
And then there was a wee question as well about the first 2 case studies. So what interventional actions, what did Hourglass do?
Okay.
Sorry, multitasking now, you say?
I know, which throws me completely. Well, I can certainly speak to Roy's story. Roy was just such a lovely man. So we were able to identify a caseworker to work with Roy, and at the start it was very much about giving Roy confidence and a voice. He was absolutely petrified of his son. He was very fearful about reporting to any statutory service because, and this would be very common with our service users, older people, if the fear reporting and the fear the reprisal, so the fear that the abuse will get worse, the fear that the only option will be to that they will be put into a home, and they also fear then the impact on the abuser. So I'll give you another example. An older man that I worked with years ago, his son coerced his terminally ill mother to sign over deeds of a holiday property that they owned, and he subsequently sold that and everything in it. So whenever the options were presented to the caller, he told me he would never take any action that would criminalise the parent of his grandchildren. So it wasn't about, he didn't want to criminalise his own son, but he didn't want the impact of that filtering down onto his grandchildren, whose lives then possibly would change forever. So I find that very interesting. But the other thing is, for a lot of the people that we work with, they will rely on the abuser for social support, connectivity, maybe rurally isolated, might need help to go to the shops or get prescriptions, all of those sorts of things. And that's why they're very reluctant in many cases to take any action. But going back to Roy, he was absolutely terrified, afraid to report. He didn't want to lose his flat. He loved it. But he just wanted the abuse to end. But he also didn't want his son to suffer, because he felt really sorry and really bad for his son, even though the situation was so awful. But eventually, anyway, we were able to work with Roy, and we worked with him to build his confidence. We got him back out going to get his shopping. We worked with him to go to the housing executive to get a new tenancy arrangement, and obviously then through a lot more support we were able to, it's not our remit, but we were able to give his son some signposting information for other organisations that would be beneficial to the circumstances that he was in, and eventually just through that process, so Roy then moved into his own place again away from his son. That property was taken back, and then the caseworker continued to work with Roy because he had moved to a different area, took him back, found a men's shed for him to go to, and went with him a couple of times until he started to meet people and get to know the other people at the group. Took him to the library, got him signed up at the library again, so it's all of those really practical things sometimes that our caseworkers will do, and then obviously we will pass on, we will refer to another organisation. In Martin's story, I'm not as familiar with the ins and outs of that particular case, but I do know that it ended up where Martin's son actually left the premises. We do, where necessary, report to social services and to the police, but we would very much encourage the individual themselves to make that referral, but where they can't or won't, we will do it on their behalf.
Okay. Well, we have lots of great feedback. People really have enjoyed this morning, and we'll share the information. And there's somebody has said, great to know the resources available through yourselves. 7 years of working with older people and the first to hear of Hourglass. So lots of great feedback, and it's great that people can share, even share the recording of today and the PowerPoint. Has anybody any questions they would like to ask just online? Sometimes a wee bit.
I do just have one question. You mentioned there about if the person isn't willing to disclose it to the police, then you will instead. My question is around consent. So what exactly do you need to be able to do that without their consent?
That's a fair point. Let me just qualify what I said. So very often the older person will not lift the phone themselves, but with our support, or they will be happy for us to do it on their behalf, and we will have their consent to do that.
Thank you.
Obviously, where there's any sort of life-threatening, life and limb situation, we have a whole different set of procedures.
So thank you very much for attending, and Veronica and Sarah, thank you very much for presenting today. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice Christmas.